Have you ever wondered how educators and community members can support immigrant families, undocumented youth, and individuals with DACA? That's exactly what this podcast is going to explore. Join us to learn more about these topics, listen to our guest stories, and explore resources to support students and their family. I'm your host, Dr. Gerardo Mancilla. I immigrated to the United States at a young age and am currently working as an associate professor of education. This is the Educators and Immigration Podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of Educators and Immigration. I'm your host, Dr. Gerardo Mancilla. I am really happy to share today's guest speaker, Alondra Garcia, who will be talking to us about her experience as an educator and all the amazing work that she is doing out in the community. Alondra Garcia is currently a second-grade bilingual teacher for the Milwaukee Public Schools. She received her bachelor's degree in elementary education with a minor in Spanish and communication from Cardinal Stritch University. Alondra immigrated from Mexico and grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Alondra, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Lalo. I'm very excited to be here.
So we are actually in Milwaukee today. We're going to have the conversation from here. One of the first things that I would like to kind of get started with is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your story?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I was born in Mexico. I immigrated to the United States alongside my younger sister and my mom and my dad as well. When I was 2 years old, I was able to receive a visa alongside with my mom and my sister. My dad unluckily didn't, so he had to find a different way of crossing the border. And we met up in Chicago and we settled in Milwaukee because half of my dad's side of the family was already, settling here for the longest. And we thought it was the perfect place just because we knew they would help us along the way. And ever since then, my parents thought that the community here in Milwaukee was very welcoming. It was thriving with immigrants, and immigrants were thriving with all the resources that the community was giving to them. So they thought, okay, we have to stay because in Mexico we don't receive this help. You don't get the health care benefits that you do, even though we knew we were undocumented. Food stamps was available, WIC was available to us, and the education aspect was very vital, very, very important. My mom said, you won't get that in Mexico. So we stayed, and ever since then, I consider Milwaukee my home.
Thank you so much for sharing about growing up. And you mentioned Milwaukee was one of those cities that was very, very welcoming for your family, as well as just for the community. What are some of the things that you noticed growing up in Milwaukee in terms of thinking about supporting immigrant communities?
Yes, so I currently live in the south side of Milwaukee, which is where I see a lot of immigrants settling just because we feel comfortable here. We've seen the resources. We see the people who are welcoming us with open arms. And you want that, you want to feel like, okay, I could be here without that pressure of people constantly trying to kick you out. It should be a place for everyone. And then seeing people from different backgrounds, not just, from Mexico, seeing from Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, wherever they're from. It's nice to see it's a mix of people.
Yeah. And I think Milwaukee also has a strong history of bilingual education and thinking about what the history of Milwaukee has been and people fighting for the different rights for different communities as well. So when I think about Milwaukee, I also think about the bilingual education and the educational system, how it has provided that support for the community as well. And Milwaukee is the largest school district as well for Wisconsin. So I think that that's also important. We're going to be talking about education down eventually. So I wanted to bring that up as well. So one of the things that I've noticed is that you've shared your story publicly in terms of being a DACA recipient. Can you talk to us about that process?
Yeah, oh my gosh. It's a hassle. It's a lot of paperwork. Sometimes I forget, I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta download all of these documents. How many is it again? Because, even though I've done it 5 times already, it's one of those things where you don't want to think about it too much, but you have to because it's your whole life, right? So when I think about it, I need to renew it 4 months before it expires. It's like, okay, I need to get the money for it because it's a $495 fee for it, almost $500, really crazy.
Yeah.
And then You have to get that paperwork all filled out correctly. Make sure if you're doing it yourself, it's in black or blue ink, and make sure it's like proofread, like have another set of eyes look at it if you're doing it by yourself. I think that's just very tedious because if you make a single error, it will get rejected. And that's the scary part. It hasn't happened yet because I've been doing it very carefully every time I have to do it. But, it could happen at any time. So when that happens, I don't know. I don't know what would be of it. I hope that the process gets easier. But in reality, what we all want as DACA recipients is, something more permanent, not have to renew every 2 years. It's a temporary work permit, and that's not enough. That's not enough.
Yeah. And when I mentioned that you had shared your story publicly, there was an article that I referenced, and I'm going to go ahead and put that on the show notes. The title of the article was 10 Years Dreaming, a Wisconsin DACA Recipient Speaks Out. And so I'll go ahead and share that in the show notes as well. And so I think one of the things that you mentioned in the article is about this idea of it's been 10 years right now. It was 2012 when it first rolled out by, at that time, President Obama. Can you talk about what was that experience as you kind of were thinking about going through school and what possibilities or what challenges you faced?
Yeah, so I was a sophomore in high school. I wasn't aware of my status at that age, even though I was a little older, because it was something I guess it was never kind of talked about at home when it should have. But once I did, because my dad was the one who was very excited for me and my other sister that we were eligible for it, he said it's going to be worth it because you're going to gain so many opportunities from this. And I didn't understand much at that point, but I did once I received it because it was a long process. Like we had to go to our middle school, elementary schools and get all these paperwork, the grades, report cards. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we really have to do all of this to prove that we were here at least 5 years, I think, for education. And then you had to prove your residency, that you were living in Milwaukee or in the United States. And that's just a hassle with it because you had to get the records from like landlords where we were renting back in that time, and then make sure everything's correctly filed in with the attorney and making sure that the attorney sees all the paperwork that is there. And if you're forgetting something, you go get it. It's just a back and forth game. It's just tedious. I say it's very, very tedious, but luckily we were able to do it. I was able to get my work permit. And once I did, I used it to start working in McDonald's. That was my first job. And I was like, okay. And, at that time, I couldn't go to school for driving because I didn't have the Social Security yet. So I decided to wait till I was 18 to be able to take the driver's test just because it was a better choice at that point. But having to wait because I didn't have a Social Security sucked, and once I did get my work permit, I had a Social Security. How crazy is that? You have to wait to get that, to be able to drive. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. And I think as you mentioned, just the idea that as you do any kind of process with immigration, you need to keep track of all your home addresses, all your work employment, all where you lived, all your health records, and all of that always becomes an issue of documenting everything. And
every single thing. It's crazy. It's crazy. But, it kept me organized. Now that I'm a teacher, I know what it means, the importance of organizing your work and having that in file, as evidence.
Yeah. I remember when I went through my own process, I had a 3-ring binder and it had different sections for each item. So I could just make sure I file everything away the same way because I had to go through the same process as well. And thinking about even, I remember school districts having to think about creating a system for them to print out the attendance records for students. And even just thinking about how do parents ask for those records. And so in the school district where I was at, they had to develop a whole system so that they could respond to the need of the students coming in and requesting that, or being able to have a button where they could click to request that. And so that made it more systematic for everybody to come through and be able to ask for those records as well. As you mentioned, that has been a long process, but anytime you deal with immigration, you have to keep track of everything. You decided to go into bilingual education as your major. Can you talk about that decision to go into bilingual education?
Well, actually, I just decided to be a teacher. So I went through the elementary education. So when there was an opening for bilingual education, I took it. But I didn't have the bilingual certification for it, so I had to go back to school and get that. Just recently, this past year, I received it. But I was like, I want to do bilingual education because I started in a bilingual program, and it's been very satisfying. I love it. Like, I predominantly work with Mexican and Puerto Rican, but I've been getting students from Central America. It's amazing to see the diversity in Milwaukee in my own classroom. So it's different. The parents are very supportive. They care about their students' education. They want to help out in any way. So I'm glad I'm where I'm at because it's my home.
And as you mentioned, going through the program yourself, it was like also thinking about how do we think about bilingualism as an additive strength as well, to be able to promote that with our students and have them become fully bilingual and fully bicultural as well. So one of the wonderings that I had was about being a DACA educator as well, or sometimes they're called Undocumented Educator or DACA Beneficiary Educator. Can you talk about what that process has been like for you, having DACA and being an educator as well?
Yeah, so being in my school, I am the only documented educator. So when I come across teachers who don't know what DACA is, it's a little shocking. But at the same time, it isn't because it's something that doesn't personally affect them. or they don't know of someone. So when they wonder, what is it? So I explain, and they're like, oh my gosh, like, wow, like, that sucks, like having to be in that situation, knowing that you love your job and, it's unstable right now. Like we don't know what's going to be of DACA. So it's always saddening because I love my job, and to just think on a daily basis, like, what if I'm not here anymore? Just because the government said so. So having to really find myself with other people who I can relate, it's hard because I am the only one there. And I've been trying to make connections with other documented educators in the district, but we're all kind of like dispersed unevenly. And I only know of a handful, but they're dealing with their own stuff, right? So one of my goals in the near future is to be able to create like a group of educators who identify as documented educators and just create that safe space for all of us to be able to talk about these issues. Like, how are we feeling on a daily basis? What can we do to support each other? What can we ask of our colleagues to support us and our families as well? Administration, like, we matter too.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, the importance of having that support, as you were talking, one of the things that comes to mind is this idea that you're not only a teacher, like taking care of the students, but you also need the additional support for yourself and the community as well. So thinking about how that can be created, ideally in an in-person setting, but even if it's not in person, thinking about a virtual setting or something where people can come together and, as DACA's in the news, potentially be able to debrief or talk about like, hey, this is what's coming up for me, or hey, this is what I'm thinking about this, or have you heard about this program, or have you heard about the other program, and be able to share a lot of resources. I think that when a lot of people think about DACA, they think about the students as well. And so it's important to also bring up the idea of DACA professionals, documented professionals, to also think about that and what is that additional support then? Or how do we continue developing those systems or those spaces for the people to be supported as well? And I think that you bring up a really great point in thinking about how to create those. And as you mentioned, DACA is always in limbo. It's been 10 years since it got started in 2012. And so according to the Migration Policy Institute, as of December 2021, there were 1 million DACA recipients living in the United States and at least 6,200 living in Wisconsin. And so thinking about then that population and how to support them. So we've been talking a lot about support, and we've been talking about how you support the students. Can you talk about if spaces maybe that you found have been extremely supportive for yourself in terms of thinking about how to take care of yourself?
Yeah, so one of the spaces I've been able to find myself having that support has been Voces de la Frontera. It's a nonprofit organization that focuses on supporting the immigrant community. I was involved in high school, not as now, but college kind of took over my life, and then I came back when I was a teacher and said, hey, like, okay, I got more time on my plate. I'm able to support my students more and the community that I serve. So I decided to join and be more vocal, involved. And ever since then, they've been very supportive because they allow me to speak about my truth my story and use that to advocate for others who aren't yet there, but give them the strength to do so. So like they learn from me and I learn from them. So we work together to get their story out too. So they created those safe spaces for me, for others. And I'm very, very grateful because ever since then, I think it's been 2-3 years that I've been very involved with them. I've made incredible relationships with so many people from different walks of life. My network has grown a lot, and it's beautiful to see, like people remember me and I remember them because of how much we have in common.
And also thinking about the activism that goes with it too. So you're an educator and also a community activist. And I feel like when I think about Voces de la Frontera, they're constantly fighting for different campaigns, constantly thinking about how to make life better for all people in Wisconsin. And so thinking about some of the campaigns that they have had in terms of in-state tuition, in terms of the driver's license, in terms of even the pay increase. Can you talk to us about some of those other campaigns?
Yeah, so the most recent one that I can think of is the campaign to end 287G, which is allowing, local state officers to act like ICE agents and ask for your immigration status. It's a horrible, horrible program that's implemented throughout the whole nation and in our state as well. Not in Milwaukee, thankfully, but around the state like Green Bay, Waukesha, Racine. It's really bad. And it's scary to know that the people who come down to Milwaukee, they drive over here knowing that they can get pulled over. And it's scary. It's like, man, they're really risking it, but you're doing it because you have to get around. And it's just nobody should be going through that. So we decided to go to Washington, D.C. to talk to Secretary Mayorkas about it, like face to face. We went to his home. And that in itself was, very confrontational, direct kind of civil disobedience. We were painting the floor, saying what we had to say in front of his household. And all of a sudden, we ended up getting so many state, local officers. The Secret Service was there. It was really, really crazy. And my sister actually got detained by one of the Secret Service agents because she was painting the floor. At that moment, she wasn't. She was just holding a paintbrush, and they just ran to her and detained her with no evidence whatsoever. I didn't know what to do at that moment because all that was going through me is like, oh my gosh, this is going to go bad. Like, what if she goes to jail? What am I going to tell my parents? Like, this is really scary. I was fired up. I was like saying things to Secret Service, like, why are you doing this? This is my sister. Leave her. Why are you attacking a young girl? She's just using her First Amendment. She isn't doing anything. And they were being very rude, But luckily, we were able to talk to the captain and ask him, like, do you have evidence that she was doing it? And he said no. So they had to release her. They did. But that was just a scary, scary experience. Traumatic, actually. My sister was very anxious because she was about to go to college. That was the summer before she started this year. And she was fearful because of her scholarships, like whether that would affect her scholarship. And luckily it didn't, and everything got solved. There wasn't any report that went in with that, but either way, the act of all of that happening was not necessary. Like, they just did that to bring fear into our community and create that whoa, we need to stop now. But we didn't. We were still vocal. We made our demands known, and he knew that we went there to make that statement. So I'm glad we still went through with it. So that's just one of the many, many experiences Voces de la Frontera goes through when dealing with these people who are in power and they say that they're in favor of us, but sadly we don't see that change happening. You all talk, but where's the action?
Yeah. First of all, is your sister doing okay now?
Yeah, she's doing good now. She's fine. Luckily, all of that is kind of in the past, but that was a scary experience for both of us.
Well, and as you mentioned, the implications that it could also have as well, going into college and potentially impacting her scholarships or anything else that might be part of her admission process as well. And thinking about then the reason to do that was to put your voice forward and to be able to advocate for the community, and also thinking about those two dynamics coming together. I'm glad that she's okay and that nothing else happened.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure I
very
mentioned that.
thankful that she's fine now.
And I think that with Voices, there's been many other initiatives and other programs and campaigns. You mentioned 287G. I believe that the last time I went into the website, there's a way that you could look up like the counties that are currently working for it. And when I saw Wisconsin, they had about 6 different counties that were currently working with it. In the past, I think Voices has been really instrumental in getting some of the counties or the sheriffs within certain counties to not work with immigration agencies. But nonetheless, there's still 6 that are still active.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, as we think about people driving around Wisconsin, those are some of the things to consider, that they're in danger as they go across some of those counties because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And so I just wanted to mention that because I think I recently looked up that 287G and kind of how many counties we had, which is scary. As
It's
you mentioned.
ridiculous, like, just to think that that's okay. That's not okay. Someone should just be able to drive to get to where they need to for a necessity, like, and that's not okay.
And across the United States, we could also think about other examples, like Arizona's SB 1070 law, and Virginia also had something similar, where they were talking about the law enforcement using this idea of they could stop somebody and ask them for their papers if they had any a reasonable doubt that they were undocumented, that they could stop and ask for those papers too.
Yeah, and it's crazy because they just do it because they see you're a person of color. That's what it is. You're a brown person. Oh, they must not have their papers. That's the only way they identify someone. And that's wrong. That's just simply wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And so that's why, as you mentioned, it's kind of important to take action and be able to be an advocate and a community activist for this. And you also participated in a 90-mile march from Milwaukee to Madison, Wisconsin, as part of VOSA's delegation of immigrant leaders and allies. Can you tell us more about this experience?
Yeah. So this was last year, so it's 2021. It was great. It was a great experience. I was able to create relationships with the people who were walking with me. We started in Milwaukee, Voces de la Frontera office on 5th Street. And it was a great celebration there. News people were there. Teachers were there. Parents were there. So we marched, and our first stop was at Greenfield. So slowly we lost people because people had to do things. But we were the ones who were going to be like holding on to the march all 9 days and, represent our people throughout these 9 days. So, like, as the days were going by slowly, we started walking through these hikes, these trails, and it was more with nature. So, like, we had a lot of time to just get to know each other, get to know the older generation that was walking with us, who've been dealing with immigration for the longest. It's incredible to see that they're out here still, advocating for themselves and their people at their age, because they're still very active. They're still very active in the community. And then we saw young people like myself advocating for our parents, for ourselves, for the younger people, and seeing Christine alongside with us. It was good to have her there all 9 days, leading us and getting to know her and her story, my story, all the people I've met along the way. Like, it was like a solid family. By the end of the 9th day, it wasn't as tiring as I thought it would be. It would average between like 5 to 8 miles a day, which was doable. We would take breaks. They would take good care of us. We had people supporting us along the way with water, with snacks, with food. We would take breaks so nobody would be dehydrated. If somebody had a blister or something, they would like take care of that blister. So it was good. We were taken good care of. And it was just great because you were not just with people, but you were there with nature, and you took in the beauty of nature. Because once you got out of the city, you started walking through the other small little towns that are in between Milwaukee and Madison. And you're like, like the difference in geographic land, like, okay, there's a lot of this and a lot of that. And the good thing is that anybody could have joined at any time during the march. So people were up to date to like where we were at. There was a lot of coverage, pictures that we're taking at certain points. So like if you were in Waukesha at that point and like wanted to join, you could join And you could march with us as much as you wanted. There was no like obligatory, like you have to mandatory, like walk with us all 9 days. And I was like, whatever you want. So we met with people of different walks of life. And it was great because even though they might have not identified as an immigrant or like someone who was directly impacted by the immigration system, they supported us. So that was great to see allies along the way showing that, you know, they care about us too. That was very touching. We were able to come across also the farmers union, farmer workers. So it was great to see them out there too. They gave us a tour of their land, so we got to see cows. So it was fun. It was fun. They served us dinners. It was really nice to see different people like supporting us, helping us along the way. And once we made it to Madison is when there was more people because that was like the last day. You know, you had people from Milwaukee who came in their own cars or in buses. So it was a good number. So once we got together with those people and started marching to the Capitol, I remember Christine telling us, you gotta be loud. We gotta be super loud. Let them know that we're here. So we did. And like when we were walking up that little hill where you could see the Capitol, I felt it and I started to cry. I started crying and it was like tears of joy. Christine was crying with me. I couldn't hold myself because I was like, we made it. Like we let ourselves do this because we care about this. This is about our life. And like we're advocating for ourselves and we're letting these politicians know. We're letting Governor Evers know, who by the way met us like halfway through and like he spoke with us. So he's in our favor. He's very supportive of the immigrant community. I love the guy, great. So it was good to see, you know, politicians supporting us. Once we made it to Madison, there was a great group of people there present, and it was a very welcoming space. People saw what we were doing, and they came along and heard what we had to say. So it was a great end to the 9-day march, seeing familiar faces, new faces come together.
Wow, it sounds like an amazing experience too, to be able to think about the coalition of partnerships and allies that also were part of like trying to support the Fuerzas de la Frontera, as well as this 9-day march. That sounds like an amazing experience too. When you were talking, I'm thinking about the marches or the protests that I've been involved with and thinking about how that would feel like to do that 9 days consecutively, where you start in one place, you have all the people together, and then you start walking together and convivir as you go through each of the places. So that must have been an awesome experience. And as you mentioned, it's also a way of advocating for the community and supporting everybody as we move forward. Voces de la Frontera has been an amazing organization that continues to fight for all of our rights as well. And I think it's important that I will have links to the different ways that people can learn more about Voces, the Instagram, the Facebook, and they have two different arms, right? So there's Voces de la Frontera, which is a non-for-profit, 501c3. And then there's Voces Acción, which is more of their political arm as well. And so people can donate to either or. So they could donate to the non-for-profit part of Voces de la Frontera, or they could donate to the Acción part of it too. And with the midterm elections coming up in November, Voces de la Frontera Acción also puts together candidates that they're endorsing as well. And so I think as the listeners are listening to this, to think about checking out some of the candidates that Voces de la Frontera Acción is endorsing to make sure that we could also follow up with the elections coming up. As you think about the work with Voces de la Frontera, are there other things that, I know it's a great organization, are there other pieces that you want to make sure you would mention in terms of Voces?
Yeah, so like Voces de la Frontera has been around for more than 20 years, and I've seen it. I've seen the growth of it. Like they started really, really small, and to see like the network that they built along the way goes to show change can happen starting small, you know, grassroots, and then growing into this by making the right connections with people and making sure people are involved and still advocating for themselves and others is what it's key. Having a great staff to support along the way gets the work done. So Voces de la Frontera, like any organization, you want to keep working to be better, and that's what they try to do. I've seen it.
Yeah. And I have also been involved with Voces. And in 2001, I remember trying to pass the DREAM Act, the first DREAM Act. I graduated high school in 2002, and so I started at Madison right after that. And Voces was already very strong at that time, too. And so I've been involved with their in-state tuition campaign and a couple of other campaigns that they've done, and they do amazing work. So kind of returning back to this idea of being a DACA educator and kind of be an advocate in the community, you're also an advocate, I'm assuming, in the schools as well, and trying to work with not only the students, but also their families and providing supports for the community as well. What is it like to be able to support your students as you think about going into your school and being there for them?
Yeah, so supporting my students looks like listening to them for one. It's very important that as educators really listen, not just to respond, but to understand. And me being young, like I have the energy, and I get it. Teacher burnout is real, especially after COVID, and we're still going through it. But you're seeing a lot of young teachers not even going into the profession anymore because of how stressful it has been because of COVID. So I really have to remind myself, like, I'm doing this for the students. Like, I enjoy being with the students, and just like motivate yourself. Remind yourself that these are young people who are learning about how to go about socializing with their friends, being able to identify their emotions, being able to control those emotions because they don't know how to. So like you have to put the example to them because you're the adult, right? You're modeling that for them. So you have to always keep yourself in check and like say, hey, like I know this student is doing X, Y, and Z. I cannot let myself get mad over this. Like, you have to be patient. You really do. Like, they're young. And even in middle school and high school, they're still learning. Like, there's adults who are still learning. So like, why do we expect kids to like already know how to manage their emotions? Like, no, we're supporting them throughout their whole career. I mean, it shouldn't stop at 18. You should always support adults too, along their whole lifespan. So that looks like that in that aspect. But academically, you could tell like a lot of my students, what I've seen, there's a big gap. And like COVID has to do with it and all the little factors along the way. But it's because, the class sizes are really large. There's not as much support as we need. The funding is not there. All these private schools are popping up everywhere, taking our students, and it's creating a lot of problems within our system. Like, public schools is great. Like, I am a public girl. I've been a public girl ever since I can remember. And I love it because of the diversity, inclusivity that I felt when I was young. And I said, I want to give back. I want to go back to the community that served me when I was young. And ever since then, I feel like I'm at home with them. So there's a lot of little aspects to what it looks like to support your students, but it begins with listening to them and knowing what their needs are and finding those resources for their needs, whether it's like for food, like if they need food at home, like knowing about these organizations that will help the families no matter what their status is, right? Because that's a big thing. Like, I think a lot of our immigrant families are scared to ask for help because they don't have Social Security, like they don't have the status for it. I'm like, no, there are programs out there that will help you without asking you for that. And it's knowing myself, like, okay, I need to look for them, and I have. So I've been able to give those resources out to my families, whether it's academically, because sometimes, teachers can't get through everything. So we ask of our parents to help us with their child, with them doing their homework. If they don't really understand it, just find like 30 minutes to help them. It's not a lot of homework. I don't give a lot of homework. They're young, I try to do most of the work at school. Reading is very important. Read at least 15 minutes a day because that really helps with their fluency. They need it. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And there's a lot of little aspects that a teacher can't do all the time, but having the support of parents is very vital because that helps out in the long term. So it has to be a collaboration between parents and teachers to, help the students succeed in life, not just as a student, but as a person as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that part of it too, of how do you take care of your students and also how do you support the families as well. One of the things that you mentioned is how do we normalize this idea of support and help? Because of Plyer versus Doe, Supreme Court 1982, the students who are undocumented have the right to free and public education from kindergarten through 12th grade. And so one of the things that I heard you say is how do we normalize this idea of providing those resources for the students? To say, here are some resources. These resources will not ask you for documentation, or if you're undocumented, you can still benefit from these resources. And I think that that's important because as we think about elementary schools, you work with elementary school kids, is how do we normalize that language so that people don't feel that they have to disclose their status but rather you just normalize as, here's some resources, here are the ones that are available if you don't have a social security number, or if you're undocumented, here are some other ones you could take advantage of, and they're there to support you as well. Because a lot of times I feel like I hear the question of, do elementary school kids know about their immigration status?
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is that it varies. Some
It
of them
varies.
do.
Yeah, and some of them don't. That's why I try to talk to my students about that, because it's very, very important for them to know, like, about themselves and, like, whether they even know about it and, like, how that's going to affect them, like, in the near future. It's already is, but, like, when they start growing up and formulating these ideas of, like, okay, so why can't I get this? And, like, that's going to start, showing up, and they should know. They should know as early as they can. But sometimes it's a hard topic to talk about, like, first, because they might be too young to understand it, but that's why you ease them into it slowly. And you just keep that conversation open. Have the child ask you whenever, like, about a topic, and you kind of give them the resource or, like, talk about it. And then eventually, hopefully, sadly, it's sad to know right now there's nothing that allows all of our immigrants to receive a pathway towards citizenship, but that they're working on it. People like myself are advocating for the immigrant community. Voces de la Frontera is advocating for it. And then we hope that in the near future, there will be una reforma migratoria, right? So that happens, and I'm very hopeful that it will be.
And the other thing that's going through my head as well as you're talking about how do you normalize language is also naming it, right? Mm-hmm. So that if you say, and I don't know what parts of it you say or don't, when I was a teacher, I would always make sure I included undocumented language into my teaching so that the students knew that if they did have a question, they could come to me and ask me about it. You mentioned the idea of support, like, what are some organizations that provide support? If you don't want to disclose it, that's okay. But here's some information that might be available as well. And so as I'm always thinking about how educators can provide that welcoming and resources for the communities and for the students, that I feel like that's one of the things that teachers do, but it's like, how do you do it in a way that's welcoming as well, to make sure that you include the undocumented community into the conversation? Yeah.
So I think what has helped me is because I identify as undocumented, and I'm very strong about that, and I vocalize that. Families feel safe to talk about their status, and that has helped me be able to, start those conversations with them and create that bond, that relationship with them, and lead to supporting them. But it is hard to, like, say that vocally, because there's still this idea, this stigma, if that's the right word, talk about it, but no, you should, because there's nothing wrong with it. Technically, none of us really belong to this country. Like, everyone is coming from different parts of the world. Why does one feel more entitled to be the citizen from this country when everyone should be entitled?
And you're calling out the nativism movement as well, like how people claim that some people don't have that right and others do. But as you mentioned, everybody should have access to the land as well as who we are here. There is the indigenous communities that was here first, and they're the ones who are the original stewards of the land. And after that, then most of us are migrants, either whether it's volunteer migration or forced migration through enslavement. But thinking about then how do we then provide that welcoming support for everybody else. I remember working with middle schoolers. So the conversations were a little bit different with middle schoolers than elementary school kids, because that's, I feel, when they're starting to develop a little bit more knowledge. Sometimes in elementary school, they already have that knowledge of what does it mean to be undocumented. Middle school, that's where there might be some other programs that they have to apply for, or some other forms that ask them about their citizenship or their social security number. I remember in Wisconsin, one of the scholarships, the DPI scholarship, asks you for a social security number. And so if my students were trying to apply for that question would always come up as well. And so I remember providing some resources to that committee to say, can we have this scholarship without that question on there and just remove it because it's not needed? The students are still going to be able to qualify for it because they're part of the school system, but can we remove that question from that form so that the students can qualify for it? The other thing you mentioned, like the stigma, and for me what came up was the fear that as we think about the 2016 election to the current environment, this anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant incidents that have been happening across the United States, that those also are kind of what our communities are experiencing too. And then that also adds that notion of we don't talk about this outside of the household because it could be dangerous.
Yeah. It can be, sadly, talking about a certain sensitive topic, your parents tell you, like, don't talk about it because it will cause problems for the whole family. It's like it's something you carry with you the whole time. But with time, I've learned that, you have to talk about these topics so people understand where you're coming from, and they actually try to put themselves in our shoes and say, like, hey, like, they're going through a lot. Like, it's something I can never relate to, but if I listen and try to understand, I could be an ally alongside them.
Yeah. So what advice would you have for undocumented youth and students?
Yeah, so my biggest advice is to stay strong and be true to yourself, because you know yourself better than anybody else. Nobody has a right to tell you who you are. You know what you stand for, what you're going through life. Nobody else is going to understand that better than yourself. Life is hard. Life will keep being hard, but, like my dad, como mi papá dice, todo tiene solución excepto la muerte. Like, everything has a solution except death. So, like, you could get through this. No matter how hard it can be, and it is going to be hard because, sadly, with not having a legal status, that causes some obstacles along the way, you can get around it. You can get around it, and I've gotten around. I'm an example for it, and I'm advocating for myself and for other undocumented students that your dreams can come true. You just gotta work double hard, right? It's a lot of work, and it's something that, our citizen peers will never understand. Going to college, I realized this because I had to work full-time, not full-time, but part-time, besides being at school, having homework to do, and on top of that, still be of a support system to my family, my parents. It's a lot of work, and it's something that they didn't understand because all they had to do was go to college and live the college life. So you have to understand that you're living a different life than them, but in the end, you know what it is to get through it, and you're first generation. You're gonna go to college. You're gonna graduate. Think about, like, all the things you will do after going through this phase of 4-year college, and it's hard. It's hard, but all the opportunities that will open for you because it was worth it. You did the work. Keep dreaming big, because there are so many opportunities, especially in Milwaukee, that will allow you to create a better version of yourself than what you thought 10 years prior where you were at. So just think about the future and how beautiful it can be, because there's a lot of great things for you in store.
Thank you so much for that advice. I agree with you that I often think about, like, when people ask me about it, I always give them the parallel of saying your path might not look exactly the same as somebody else. It might take more turns, it might take different pathways, but ultimately the goal is going to be the same. And so, as you mentioned, there's other possibilities that then can open up. Mm-hmm. Depending on what you do in life also, then there might be some other pathways or other doors that open up down the line as well. So as we think about supporting undocumented students with DACA, are there other conversations that you feel like are missing from thinking about how do we become a source of support for them?
Yeah, so I think the term intersectionality is missing in these conversations, because you're undocumented, but also you might be a female or a male, or you might be non-binary or gender non-conforming, right? So it's like there's a lot of identities that are being left out of these conversations, and then that just adds to is the fear of you being all these identities, because it's intersectionality is creating fear for you because there's no space that's been created for you. It's like, where do we start? How can we support those students who fall in certain categories? That's where I want to start figuring out, okay, how can I support these students? Because it hasn't happened yet with my age group, but I've come across like middle school and high school students who don't know what to do, in aspects like, okay, how do I get the support, and like, how do I help them? And like, I find myself stuck. It's like, oh my gosh, I hate being stuck and not knowing how to support them, because I haven't come across that yet, but that's a great learning opportunity. Like, how can I do it? Right? It's like, then you start looking for those resources around Milwaukee, and there's plenty of resources, organizations that help out students who find themselves in this intersectionality with their identities. So there's conversations that still need to happen, and I think slowly our district is doing it, but they need to catch up. Let's just say that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in, central office, and it's possible, but we just need to get the right people in there to do the work.
And I'm also thinking about how to connect with other organizations, whether it be non-for-profits that are addressing some of those intersectional identities that are happening for some of our students. There's a couple of them that I'm from the Madison area, and so there's a couple of them that come to mind for me in terms of if somebody identifies as undocumented, Latino, and gay as well, for example. So then there's 3 different identities that are there. How do we support all 3 identities simultaneously and create a space for the students that they can explore those identities all consistently, or all at the same time and consistently thinking about what does it mean to be supported with all my 3 identities, for example. And so I think that you bring up another important point that is important to consider that we haven't discussed that as much, that I think is important to think about, and think about maybe having somebody on the podcast that can address multiple of those identities as well. So one of the things that usually comes up towards the end of the interviews is like how people can connect with you or get to know more about you. Are you okay with people reaching out to you?
Yeah, of course. I'm always open to meeting new people and helping, supporting people in any way, shape, or form. I'm open arms.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it having you on here. Talking about DACA educators has been one of the topics that I've been wanting to have for a while. And so I'm greatly appreciative that you're here and that we can continue this conversation. As a fellow educator, I think that this is very important. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And for the rest of you, please have a great day. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Educators and Immigration podcast. You can find out more information about us at www.educatorsandImmigration.com. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share our podcast with your family, friends, and colleagues. You could also leave us a review and rate us on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great day.